lot of great things are happening here. This past Friday night, had a little women's banquet here. Pretty amazing thing, yeah. Actually, the largest single women's event ever in the history of this church, 48 years. I had a couple people ask me, I said, so it was just single women? I said, no, the largest single women's event. Seems simple to me, but apparently it wasn't. But anyway, a lot of great things going on. The Light Spectacular, I don't know if you've seen it yet or not. Fort Worth Star-Telegram says it's one of the top 10 places to see Christmas lights. Say, why, Pastor, why would our church do that? Because when people come looking for the star, they're going to see the cross. That's all about that. And we want to get people on our campus. And if they come here and find out, hey, it's not, the sky won't fall in on you or whatever, they might come back for a service. And everything we do is about that. Tonight, children's program, Christmas musical, Camelot in the gym. Come early to get a seat. And that's going to be amazing. A lot of great things that are happening. I want you to take your Bibles and turn to Luke chapter 2, and I'll be there in just a moment. While you're turning there, I have to tell you something happened yesterday. My wife did something she's done every year at Christmas. She sent me a message and said, what do you want for Christmas? Happens every year. And I always respond the same way. I don't need anything. I've got everything's fine, whatever. But she kept being persistent. She kept pushing me. So I gave her a list. And she wrote back and said, this is helpful. So I sent her some more. It turns out we all have a list, right? And your church does too. You may notice in your program there's a Christmas list there. I ask our staff, what are some things if you put on the Christmas list that could really help our ministry? Those are not budgeted items. Those are things way above and beyond. And but if God's blessed you or your family or your business in a way where you could help us with the top 10 Christmas list for your church this year, that would be awesome as well. Well, hopefully you're in Luke 2. I'm going to be there in just a moment. But I got to tell you, first of all, Max Lucado has a brand new book out called Unshakable Hope. You need to get it. Now, I don't know if there's any left in the bookstore after the first service, but you need to order yours. You need to get a copy of this book. And I want to share a quote from that book to set the stage for what we're going to talk about this morning. Here's what Max Lucado said in his new book, Unshakable Hope. Listen carefully. He said, we might assume the storms would have stopped. Jesus was on the earth, after all. He made the planet. He invented storm systems. He created the whole idea of atmosphere, wind, and rain. We might assume for the time he was on the earth that the world would have been storm-free. That God would have suspended the laws of nature and spared his son the discomfort of slashing rains and howling winds. Or at the very least, we might suppose that Jesus would have walked around in a bubble, like the Pope does when he drives through crowds. Encircle the Savior with a protective shield so he doesn't get soaked or cold or frayed or windswept. Jesus should be spared from the storms of life. And so should we, Max says. Lingering among the unspoken expectations of the Christian heart is this. Now that I belong to God, I get a pass on the tribulations of life. I get a bubble. Others face storms. I live to help them, but face my own? No way. To follow Jesus is to live a storm-free life, right? That expectation crashes quickly on the rocks of reality. The truth of the matter is this: life comes with storms. Jesus assures us, in this world you will have trouble. John 16:33. Storms will come to you, to me. And with that background, would you stand for the reading of God's Word? Luke chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Luke says, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered or taxed. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea in the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. You may be seated, and may God add his blessing to the reading of his word. A lot of people have messed up ideas when it comes to the Christmas story. Many have the idea it's this sweet, wonderful story about everything going just right. And it is a sweet and wonderful story, but the truth is, everything didn't go just right. In fact, if you look at the Christmas story, you're going to be more prone to say, almost everything was wrong. For example, number one, the setting for the story was a decree given by Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered or taxed, as the King James Version says. It wasn't the beginning of taxes in the Roman world, but it was the beginning for the Jews. You see, prior to this time, they were not allowed to serve in the Roman army, so they weren't subject to taxation. But the powers that be in the government of Rome decided, here's a way to get more revenue, and so they began this registration process with property taxes and income taxes that the Jews would come to hate and despise as another symbol of Roman oppression. Number two, Mary and Joseph were descendants of David, so they had to travel 70 miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem in Judea. Now, it's about the distance from our campus to Glen Rose. Now, some of us have been in the Holy Land, and we've made that trip from Nazareth to Bethlehem on a bus, and even then, it's a long trip. They were walking some 70 miles. Joseph walked the whole way, I'm sure. Mary probably walked some of it, but rode on the back of a mule. Number three, Mary was pregnant, on the verge of delivery. Now remember verse 2, they traveled 70 miles, and she rode on a mule. Now the setting for this story is far from perfect or ideal. Number 4, when they got to Bethlehem, there was no place for them to stay. Has that ever happened to any of you? I remember years ago, our family around a holiday had gone to Colorado Springs, and we had reservations at the Holiday Inn on Garden of the Gods Road. And there'd been flight delays because of storms and all that kind of stuff. And we got there just before midnight, and when I got to the desk, they'd given our rooms away. Now, this was 20-some years ago. They don't do that anymore. Now they charge your credit card whether you show up or not. They're giving our rooms away. Here I am with my family, and there's no place to stay in a town that I didn't know anything about. Now, it wasn't a perfect setting in Bethlehem. Number 5, when the baby was born, they had no place to put him except in a manger made of stone. You slept on a hard bed? Slept on a tile floor someplace? Maybe you went to a college dormitory for a college weekend and it was fun and exciting because you knew it was going to be temporary. No one puts a newborn baby on a rock. They did. That's all that was available. Number 6, the only people to come and visit right after the birth were a bunch of shepherds. Now get this picture. Only the outcasts of society who spent every waking moment and even their sleeping moments by filthy, dirty, smelly sheep. Imagine the aroma as they showed up to pay their respects to the newborn baby. And by the way, where would they have washed up before they came? Didn't happen. And all of that sets the stage for what I want you to get this morning. Last week we saw that if you still want to have a wonderful life, you have to realize you matter to God. And if you miss that, you need to watch it. You need to go online on our website and watch it so you can catch up. But here's the second truth you've got to get today, and that's this. You can still have a wonderful life if you realize that every problem is an opportunity for a blessing. Every problem is an opportunity for a blessing. The Christmas story is a perfect illustration of that. Now don't miss this. In the midst of all the problems that Mary and Joseph faced came the opportunity for a blessing they would treasure the rest of their lives. And that's the concept that you and I need to wrap our heads and our hearts around this morning. Problems provide the platform for providential provision. Problems provide the platform for providential provision. Now, let me tell you what I know about me and what I rather suspect is true about you. I want a problem-free life. Can I get a witness? But when I'm praying away the problems, I'm also separating myself from the blessings. Because every problem comes with the opportunity for a blessing. In fact, I would take it a step further and say that when God is sending blessings into our lives, He generally disguises them, you're already ahead of me, as problems. There's a movie that illustrates that beautifully for us. It's called It's a Wonderful Life. Recognized by the American Film Institute as the most inspirational American film ever made. You have watched it, haven't you? This year? If not, you should. You got to remember, it was panned by the public, canned by the critics, because the movie was too dark. It was too depressing. I mean, who wants to see a movie about a guy where everything in the world goes wrong? That's essentially the storyline of It's a Wonderful Life. Setting of the movie was during the worst economic depression in American history, the most devastating war humanity had ever seen. And if you've seen it, you remember George Bailey's plans, all of his dreams went right down the drain. He didn't get to be a world traveler. He didn't get to go to college. He didn't get to leave his little old going nowhere town, Bedford Falls. He didn't get to leave the family business, Bailey Brothers Building and Loan Association. He didn't get to build famous things that people talk about or make lots of money. And to make matters worse, his friends did get to do all that. His friend Sam Wainwright went away and made all kinds of money. His brother went away to college, became a war hero. Not George. So he ends up in a bar trying to drown his troubles, and he thinks he doesn't have a prayer. Sound familiar? You ever had those moments in life? In the midst of all the problems George Bailey faced, came the opportunities for the blessings he would treasure for the rest of his life. In fact, by the end of the movie, he realizes that each of those problems, every one of them, were blessings. You ever notice how that works in your life? You know, now if we look back, all of us, if we look back, we can look back at some of the worst things in our life and say, you know, I didn't know it at the time, but, you know, that really was a blessing. It's amazing how that turned out. I mean, we know Romans 8:28 is in the Bible, right? We know that all things work together for good to them that love God and are called according to His purpose. We just don't believe it. For us. For our problems. We look back on the worst times in our lives and see how God used those to bless us and to replace pain with prosperity, our hurts with hope, our trials with triumphs. Chris was 9 years old when he faced the biggest storm of his life. He was diagnosed with mononucleosis. The doctor ordered him to stay inside for the entire summer. Imagine that. Chris was a rambunctious, athletic, outgoing kid. But to be told that he had to spend the summer indoors, no Little League baseball, no fishing trips, no bike rides. I mean, you might as well trap an eagle in a birdcage. Chris's dad, however, was a man of faith. He resolved to somehow find good in the quarantine. He sold guitars at his drugstore, and he wasn't a half-bad guitarist himself, so he gave Chris a guitar, and each morning he would teach him a new chord or a technique, and he told him to practice that all day long. Chris did. Turns out he was pretty good with a guitar. And by the end of the summer, Chris was playing Willie Nelson tunes, and he was even beginning to write a few songs of his own. Within a few years, he was leading worship in churches. Within a few decades, he was regarded as the most sung songwriter in the world. Perhaps you've heard some of his music. How Great Is Our God, Holy Is the Lord, Jesus Messiah. That summer storm gave us a sensational songwriter and worship leader named Chris Tomlin. You see, every problem is an opportunity for a blessing. So, well, you don't know my problem. Doesn't matter. It's an opportunity for a blessing. Yeah, but you don't know the big problems that we're facing right now. Doesn't matter. It's an opportunity for a blessing. And if you pray the problems away, if you say, God, I don't want any of these problems, you're pushing away from the blessings that He wants to send your way. I know this is completely opposite of what you've believed your whole life. But it's what the Bible teaches. God's ways are not the ways of the world. His thoughts are not our thoughts. He says if you want to be the greatest of all, you have to what? Be the servant. He says if you want to gain your life, you've got to give it away. He said if you want to have more, you have to be generous and give more. Doesn't make sense by the world's standards. But when you start following His standards, it all makes sense. And every problem is an opportunity for a blessing. Disappointment is still an appointment. Write the word down. Look at it. It's still an appointment. And God will somehow use the disappointments of your life to keep His appointment of blessing you. It may look like a mess to you, but what you don't know and what you need to remember is that God has scheduled a blessing for you in the middle of that mess. And you'll soon see it. Problems provide the platform for providential provision. In the Chinese language, it's interesting that the word for crisis is the same word for opportunity. They get it. Paul got it too in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. He recorded the testimony of God when God said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And Paul went on to say, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest on me." If you want to have a wonderful life, you need to understand every problem is an opportunity for a blessing. You know, one of the verses we love to read every year at Christmas time is Isaiah 7:14. You may not know the reference, but you know the verse. It says, "Therefore the Lord Himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call His name Emmanuel." Now you know the verse. But most people don't know the context of that great prophecy. In Isaiah chapter 7, Israel, that's 10 of the Hebrew tribes, and Aram, that's Syria, were about to attack Judah, the 2 tribes from the line of David. So they were getting ready for war. The boys were putting on camo. They were getting ready to leave home and fight. Mothers were reluctantly helping with preparations, fixing food, fighting back tears. And in the midst of those preparations, God gave a promise. He promised to use Assyria to wipe out Aram and Israel, and He invited King Ahaz of Judah to believe Him and to ask for a sign. But King Ahaz wouldn't do it. In fact, in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 12, King Ahaz said, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." That was false humility if you've ever seen it. He didn't expect how anywhere in the world good could come out of the mess they were facing. So you know what God said to him? God said to King Ahaz, He said, "All right, if you don't want my encouragement, then Assyria will come after you too. And Assyria will conquer you. And life is going to get really difficult." Now, can I just share a quick statement? Not trusting God is never a good choice. Never. God said the land won't produce for you. Your vineyards will turn to thorns. Assyria will plunder you. But in the midst of all that, God said, here's the sign I'll give to you. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now in Isaiah chapter 8, verses 5 and 8, the Bible tells us because the people of Judah wouldn't trust God, he was going to allow the Assyrians to overwhelm them like a flood. In verse 8, he says, it will sweep on into Judah, it will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. See, these were God's people. And God, because of their choices, God was allowing them to be in a time of great problems. He said, you're my people, you're my children, but you're still, because you chose, this is what you're going to get. But in the midst of that, there's a word from God to the enemy nations. Verse 10, he says, devise your strategy, but it will be thwarted. Propose your plan, but it will not stand, for God is with us. Now don't miss this. Because King Ahaz and the people of Judah wouldn't trust God, they were going to be pounded with problems. They were going to be surrounded by Assyrians. Life was going to be miserable. But God said, I'm going to be right there with you. In the midst of your problems. In the midst of great opposition. In the midst of tremendous trials. He said he would never leave them or forsake them. 700 years later, instead of sending another angel or a prophet, God sent his only son to be born of a virgin. And Matthew records it this way in verse 21, chapter 1, verses 21 to 23. He said, she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Isaiah 7:14. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Matthew saw what God wanted King Ahaz and Judah to see. Matthew understood what God wanted King Ahaz and Judah to understand. And it's the same message he wants you and I to get at Christmas. And that's this. Every problem is the opportunity for a blessing. Someone said, cripple a man, you have Sir Walter Scott. Lock him in prison, you have John Bunyan. Bury him in the snows of Valley Forge, and you have George Washington. Raise him in poverty, and you have Abraham Lincoln. Strike him down with infantile paralysis, and he becomes Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Burn him so severely, doctors say he will never walk again, and you have Glenn Cunningham, who set the world record for the 4-minute mile in 1934. Deafen him, and you have Ludwig van Beethoven. Call him a slow learner, say he's retarded. Write him off as impossible to educate, and you have Albert Einstein. All of them illustrate every problem is simply the opportunity for blessing. Don Moen, who's one of the most prolific Christian songwriters in the world, several years ago was awakened in the middle of the night. His mother-in-law called to tell him of a tragic car accident involving his wife's sister, Susan. Susan and her husband, Craig, and their 4 little boys were on a trip when the tragedy occurred. Jeremy, age 8, and the oldest of the 4 boys, was killed instantly. The others were seriously injured. As Don and his wife grieved and poured out their hearts to the Lord, they felt helpless at communicating hope and grace to Susan and her husband, Craig. Don recalled how God helped him through the tragedy. He said, it was as if the Lord gave me these words, which have now become one of the most loved praise songs of all time. God will make a way where there seems to be no way. He works in ways we cannot see. He will make a way for me. He will be my guide, hold me closely to his side with love and strength for each new day. He will make a way. And listen, if you still want to have a wonderful life, you need to know this morning, you need to realize you matter to God. And you also need to realize every problem is an opportunity for a blessing. Let's pray.